My aunt sued me for $50,000 after I saved her son from a seizure. I'm the happiest I've ever been right now, but my family still tells me I should have gotten an abortion instead of ruining my life. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. My Aunt Patty will literally walk up to me, take my daughter Gracie right out of my arms without even asking, and announce that I clearly need a break before I've had a chance to say hello to anyone. That's just how it is with them. Having Gracie when I was 18 probably didn't help my case with these people. All my relatives whispered about me being another statistic, another cautionary tale about irresponsible teenagers. When I was in labor, they actually asked my fiancé when he was planning his escape. Even now, years later, my grandmother still tries to take over feeding Gracie because apparently I'm doing everything wrong. She'll literally snatch the spoon from my hand mid-bite and announce to whoever's listening that I'm the black sheep of the family who can't even feed her own baby properly. Last weekend, everything came to a head at my cousin Rachel's birthday party. The entire extended family showed up. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, basically everyone who's ever had an opinion about my life choices was crammed into Rachel's house. During lunch setup, my Uncle Dennis made his favorite joke about babies having babies while staring directly at me. I work in healthcare. I literally save lives for a living, but sure, Uncle Dennis, very funny. Then my mom's friend Carol cornered me by the drinks table. Such a shame, she said loud enough that half the room could hear her. You had so much potential, she told me. Now you're just stuck playing house instead of actually living your life. I smiled politely because what else was I supposed to do? Make a scene at my cousin's party? My husband Brian was out getting Gracie's diaper bag from the car when my uncles intercepted him in the driveway. I watched the whole thing from the window. Uncle Dennis put his hand on Brian's shoulder like they were having some serious man-to-man talk. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Brian told me later. They told him he didn't have to stay with me, that no one would judge him for leaving, that he was too young to be tied down like this. They actually offered to help him find an apartment. Can you believe that? When he came back inside, they seated the three of us at a separate table away from everyone else. Real subtle, right? Making it very clear that we didn't belong with the real adults. Honestly, I felt happier sitting apart from them anyway. At least I didn't have to listen to more comments about my life choices. Then Aunt Patty swooped in and grabbed Gracie right out of her high chair without asking permission. You looked overwhelmed, sweetheart, she said in that condescending voice she uses. Babies are so hard, aren't they? Do you regret it now that you know what it's really like? She didn't wait for me to respond. She just carried Gracie away, parading my crying daughter around the party like she'd just rescued her from an abusive situation. Everything changed after they brought out the birthday cake. My 3-year-old cousin Zachy was running around with his slice, laughing and being a typical energetic toddler. Then, he just stopped mid-laugh. His whole body went completely still. His eyes rolled back in his head. His body went rigid, and he collapsed onto the floor. His limbs started jerking violently. Aunt Patty screamed, "Oh my God, someone call 911.
Zachy's dying."
Her husband, Uncle Dennis, rushed over with a spoon in his hand and dropped to his knees beside Zachy. We need to put this in his mouth so he doesn't swallow his tongue, he shouted. He was trying to prise Zachy's jaw open while Aunt Patty sobbed hysterically beside him. My other family members either froze completely or started fumbling with their phones trying to call 911. Everyone was talking over each other so loudly that the operators probably couldn't understand anything they were saying. That's when my training kicked in. I jumped up from our isolated table and pushed through the crowd of panicking relatives. "Don't touch him," I said firmly. "Move the chairs away from him. He's having a febrile seizure." I dropped to my knees next to Zachy. Uncle Dennis actually tried to physically wrestle with me. He was screaming that I was going to kill his son. I had to grab his shoulders and shake him hard enough to get his attention. "Stop crying and calm down," I told him. "You're making this worse." I gently turned Zachy onto his side and immediately checked my phone to start a timer. My medical training was taking over completely now. Brian appeared right beside me and started pulling off Zachy's sweater. "He's burning up," Brian said calmly. The fever triggered the seizure. He motioned for everyone to step back while I carefully positioned Zachy's head to keep his airway clear. "Do something," Zachy's dad shouted at us. "Why aren't you doing anything?" The whole family was absolutely losing their minds around us. These same people who'd spent years telling me I was too young and too irresponsible and too stupid were now throwing up and crying while I calmly saved their child's life. I kept monitoring Zachy's breathing pattern. "He's been seizing for 3 minutes," I said out loud. Febrile seizures usually stop within 5 minutes. "We're okay right now." I turned to Brian and told him to help Patty calm down so she could talk to her son. Brian immediately switched into the mode we'd practiced from his parenting book. "You need to talk to him like this," he told Patty in a low, steady voice. Low and rhythmic. He demonstrated for her. "Hey buddy, you're okay. Mom is right here. You're completely safe." He guided her to copy his calm tone while I kept Zaki positioned safely on his side. The seizure stopped at 4 minutes and 15 seconds. I'd been counting every second in my head while keeping track on my phone timer. Zaki started crying immediately, confused and terrified about what had just happened. Brian scooped him up right away, holding him chest to chest, humming in this low vibration that I've seen calm Gracie down dozens of times. Skin-to-skin contact helps regulate their nervous system faster after a seizure, Brian explained to the shocked family members. It's covered in Chapter 3 of my book about post-seizure comfort techniques. Book? My grandmother gasped. She seemed more shocked that we knew what we were doing than relieved that her grandchild was alive and breathing. What book? Basic Parenting for Teen Parents, I said quickly while still monitoring Zaki's condition. Patty immediately scrambled for her phone and Googled the title. Her face went from relieved to angry in about 2 seconds. 750 reviews, she said slowly, turning to stare at us like we'd personally offended her. 750 reviews on a book about parenting? And you almost let my nephew die at a birthday party? You should be ashamed of yourselves writing this stuff while not being able to protect a kid from almost dying. I'm suing you for child endangerment, she announced. Before I could even process what she'd said, she was already on her phone calling lawyers. The worst part is I knew she was serious. Once Patty saw those 750 reviews and realized the book had probably made decent money, nobody was going to stop her. She was completely set on taking our money, destroying our family, and probably trying to get custody of Gracie somehow. I just stood there in Rachel's living room while Patty yelled into her phone about lawyers and lawsuits. Her face kept getting redder with every word. Everyone was staring at me like I'd actually done something wrong, like I hadn't just saved her son's life maybe 5 minutes ago. Brian walked over and gently took Gracie from my arms without saying anything. Then he leaned close and quietly told me we should leave before this got any worse. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grab our diaper bag from the chair. I looked around at my family one more time. The same people who'd just watched me handle that medical emergency perfectly. And I realized they all believed Patty's version of events instead of what they'd seen with their own eyes. We walked out while Patty was still screaming into her phone. Nobody tried to stop us or say goodbye. The car ride home was completely silent except for Gracie babbling happily in her car seat. She was making those little sounds she always makes when she's content. She had absolutely no idea that our entire lives had just changed in the last hour. Brian didn't say anything until we pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine. He sat there for a full minute before turning to look at me. His voice was steady, but I could hear the worry underneath when he said we needed to document everything that happened today. I nodded because I was already replaying every single moment in my head, going through each step we'd taken and knowing we'd done everything exactly right. We got Gracie inside, and I put her down for her nap while Brian grabbed his laptop from the bedroom. He set it up on the kitchen table and opened a new document. "We should start from the very beginning," he said. I sat down next to him and started talking through the entire timeline while he typed. We recorded the exact times, what each family member said and did, everything we could remember. Gracie woke up after about an hour and came toddling into the kitchen with her favorite stuffed bear. I set her up with her blocks on the floor where I could see her. Brian pulled up the seizure management chapter from his book on his phone. We compared our actions to the published protocol step by step. We'd followed every single thing perfectly. I grabbed my phone and started taking screenshots of all the book reviews before Patty's threatened lawsuit could somehow damage them. I scrolled through pages and pages of 5-star ratings and comments from parents thanking Brian for his practical advice. I had this sick feeling in my stomach that told me this was about to get so much worse than just empty threats at a birthday party. Brian must have felt the same way because he started gathering photos from the party that people had already posted on Facebook. He saved everything to a folder on his computer. By midnight, we'd created this entire documentation folder. Our complete timeline, all the photos, copies of Brian's credentials including his pediatric first aid certifications, and screenshots of everything we could think of. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I sat there looking at all this documentation. My own aunt was willing to destroy us financially over something we'd handled correctly. Something that literally saved her son's life. Brian closed his laptop and pulled me over to the couch. He wrapped his arms around me and promised we'd get through this together. I wanted to believe him, but I could hear the fear in his voice too. That slight tremor that meant he was just as terrified as I was about what Patty might actually do with her lawyer. We finally went to bed around 1 in the morning. I barely slept. Just stared at the ceiling thinking about lawyers and lawsuits and how much money we didn't have to fight this. I woke up at 6 when my phone started buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. 17 missed calls from different family members I hadn't talked to in months or even years. I opened Facebook and saw that Patty had posted this long rant claiming we'd stood by and done nothing while Zachy nearly died. That we'd refused to help and just watched him seize. The post already had 43 comments. I scrolled through them feeling sicker with each one. Relatives I barely knew were all agreeing that I was an unfit mother who'd endangered a child. Someone I'd never even met in my life commented that teen moms shouldn't be allowed to have kids. Brian found me in the bathroom at 6:30 sitting on the floor crying while I read through more comments. He took my phone away from me and held my hands. He reminded me that social media wasn't reality. These people didn't know what actually happened. My mom called at 7 and I actually felt hopeful for a second when I saw her name on the screen. Maybe she'd be on my side for once. I answered, and she immediately asked why I'd made such a scene instead of letting the adults handle Zachy's emergency. I tried to explain that I am an adult, and I literally saved his life with my medical training. She cut me off before I could finish. She said Patty was just upset, and I should apologize to keep the peace in the family. I hung up without saying goodbye because I didn't trust myself not to start yelling at my own mother. Brian's phone started ringing with numbers we didn't recognize. He ignored the first few calls but finally answered one around 8. I watched his face change completely as he listened to whoever was on the other end. No comment, he said firmly and hung up. He told me it was a reporter from some local parenting blog. They were asking about the controversial teen parent author whose negligence led to a child's hospitalization. We both realized at the same time that Patty must have contacted media outlets with her twisted version of what happened. Brian immediately called his book publisher to warn them about potential negative press coming their way. I forced myself to get ready for work because I had a shift scheduled and my patients needed me. Plus, I thought maybe the normalcy would help somehow. I dropped Gracie off at daycare and drove to the hospital trying to focus on my job instead of everything falling apart around us. My supervisor pulled me aside after morning rounds. Her voice was gentle but concerned when she asked if everything was okay at home. She said someone had called the hospital claiming I was under investigation for child endangerment. I explained the whole situation as calmly as I could while internally panicking that Patty's lies were reaching my workplace now too. During my lunch break, I made the mistake of looking at Facebook again. I felt physically sick reading more comments. Relatives were describing me as always irresponsible and too young to handle emergencies. People who'd barely spoken to me in years suddenly had very strong opinions about my parenting abilities. Carol had commented that she'd tried to warn everyone about my poor judgment. She was referencing those cruel things she'd said at the party about me ruining my life. Not a single family member had defended me or even acknowledged that Zachy was alive because of what I did. My phone buzzed with a text from Brian. His book sales had dropped 30% since yesterday. Several parenting forums were discussing whether his credentials were even legitimate. His publisher was concerned about the optics and wanted to pause the entire marketing campaign until this blew over. I sat there in the break room staring at his text. Patty's lawsuit threat was already costing us money even though she hadn't actually filed anything yet. I finished my shift in complete fog and drove home on autopilot. My mind kept replaying Brian's text about the sales drop over and over. When I pulled into our driveway, I noticed a white envelope wedged between our front door and the frame. The return address showed a law firm I'd never heard of. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a formal letter on heavy paper with raised letterhead. I had to read the first paragraph 3 times before the words actually made sense. Patty and Dennis were demanding $50,000 for emotional distress, medical expenses, and negligent supervision. The letter claimed we'd failed to act appropriately during Zachy's seizure and caused lasting trauma to their family. My vision got blurry as I kept reading. They wanted Brian to stop selling his book immediately and issue a public apology admitting his parenting advice was dangerous and nearly killed a child. I walked inside, still holding the letter, feeling like I might actually throw up. Brian was in the kitchen making dinner with Gracie in her high chair. He took one look at my face and put down the spatula. I handed him the letter without saying anything and watched his expression change as he read it. We sat at the kitchen table for over an hour reading that letter again and again, trying to understand how saving a child's life had somehow turned into this nightmare. The legal language made it sound like we'd stood by doing nothing while Zachy was in danger. One section actually claimed that Dennis's attempt to put a spoon in Zachy's mouth was the correct medical response, that we should have supported it instead of interfering. I started laughing because the whole thing was so completely ridiculous. But then the laugh turned into crying and I couldn't stop. Brian pulled his chair next to mine and held my hand while I sobbed. Gracie kept trying to give me her stuffed bear from across the table. She could sense something was wrong. The letter listed specific damages including therapy costs for Zachy, lost wages for Patty who'd taken time off work, and compensation for their ongoing emotional suffering. They'd attached a deadline of 7 days to respond or they'd file a lawsuit in court. Brian got up and pulled our emergency folder from the drawer, the one with all our documentation from the party. We spread everything out on the table next to the legal letter, comparing what actually happened to what Patty's lawyer was claiming. I remember my coworker Sarah mentioning a family law attorney who'd helped her sister with a custody issue. I dug through my text to find the name. Kayla Norris. I called the number Sarah had sent me even though it was almost 7 at night. I expected to leave a voicemail. A woman answered on the third ring. I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. She listened without interrupting and then asked a few quick questions about the timeline and whether we had documentation. When I told her about our folder with timestamps and photos, she made this approving sound. She could meet with us tomorrow morning at 9, if we could make it work. Then she warned us that even completely ridiculous lawsuits cost money to defend. We should prepare for legal fees. I felt Brian squeeze my hand as she said that. After we hung up, we sat there doing math in our heads about how much our savings could actually cover. Our emergency fund had about $8,000. We'd been planning to use some of that for a new car since Brian's was making weird noises. Now all that money might have to go to lawyers instead. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Brian slept fitfully next to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patty's face at the party. The way she'd looked at us with pure hatred while holding her phone. My own family had turned on me so fast it still didn't feel real. I kept thinking about all the times I'd excused their comments about my age or my choices, telling myself they meant well. But this wasn't concern. This was vindictive and cruel. My grandmother hadn't called once since the party to check if I was okay or to hear my side of the story. That hurt worse than Patty's lawsuit in some ways. At 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went to Gracie's room. She was sleeping peacefully with her favorite blanket bunched under her chin. I stood there watching her breathe, feeling so protective it made my chest physically hurt. Brian and I had built this little family despite everyone saying we'd fail. We had a home and jobs and a happy, healthy daughter. And now my relatives wanted to take it all away because we'd saved a child's life. I stayed in Gracie's room until the sun started coming up, just watching her sleep and promising myself I'd fight for our family no matter what it cost. The law office was in a professional building downtown. We arrived 15 minutes early because we were both too nervous to wait at home. Kayla met us in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She led us to a conference room and spread our folder contents across the table while asking questions. Her assessment was both comforting and scary at the same time. She said Patty's claims were legally weak because we'd followed proper medical protocol, but the case would still require a formal legal response that costs money. She looked at our timeline and called it excellent documentation. Then she explained that family lawsuits often got messy and emotional in ways that regular cases didn't. The retainer fee was $3,000 just to get started. She estimated the total cost could reach $10,000 to $15,000 if Patty actually filed in court and we had to go through the whole process. I felt sick hearing those numbers. Brian's hand was shaking when he signed the retainer agreement. Kayla asked us to walk through exactly what happened during the seizure. We took turns describing every detail. She nodded as we talked and made notes on a legal pad. When we finished, she confirmed we'd followed proper medical protocol exactly. Then she got really interested in Brian's book. She asked about his credentials and training. She said his expertise would actually help our defense a lot. She wanted to know about our relationship with Patty before this incident. I admitted she'd always treated me like an incompetent child who couldn't handle being a mother. She'd grab Gracie without asking and make comments about me being too young. But she'd never threatened legal action before or claimed I was dangerous. Kayla wrote that down and said the pattern of behavior might be relevant. She asked if we'd had any contact with family members since the party. I told her about the phone calls and Facebook comments. Kayla's voice got firm when we started talking about strategy. She said we absolutely could not respond to anything on social media while the legal threat was active. No posts, no comments, no trying to defend ourselves publicly. She'd send a formal response to Patty's lawyer stating we acted appropriately and rejecting all their demands. I asked if we should countersue for defamation since Patty had posted lies about us on Facebook. Kayla shook her head. She explained that would escalate everything and cost even more money. The goal was to make this go away as cheaply and quickly as possible. Not to punish Patty, even though she deserved it. She'd include our documentation and Brian's credentials in her response to show we had a strong defense. Then she coached us on how to handle any family members who tried to contact us. Keep it brief. Don't discuss the case. Refer them to our attorney. Brian asked what would happen if Patty filed in court anyway. Kayla walked us through that entire process. On the way home from Kayla's office, Brian was quiet for a long time. Finally, he admitted he was scared about the money. Between the legal fees and his book sales dropping, we were looking at losing maybe $20,000 or more. We sat in the car outside our house while he pulled up our bank accounts on his phone. We did the math together, calculating what we could afford if this dragged on for months. Our emergency fund would cover Kayla's retainer and maybe one more payment. After that, we'd have to dip into Gracie's college fund. The account had about $15,000 we'd been saving since she was born. I felt horrible that my family's toxicity was threatening our daughter's future. Brian tried to reassure me that we could rebuild the college fund later, but I could hear the worry in his voice. We sat there for almost 20 minutes, just staring at the numbers on his phone screen. Both of us too overwhelmed to go inside yet. My phone rang that afternoon while I was folding laundry. I didn't recognize the number. A professional woman's voice introduced herself as Grace Ferguson from Child Protective Services. She said they'd received a report of child endangerment involving our family and needed to schedule a home visit. My stomach felt like I'd been punched. I had to sit down on the couch because my legs went weak. Grace's tone stayed neutral and professional as she explained this was standard procedure for any report involving a young child. She needed to come see our home and talk to us about the allegations. I managed to ask what the report claimed. She said someone had reported we had a history of neglect and had endangered a child at a family gathering. I knew immediately it was Patty. She hadn't just sued us. She'd called CPS to try to get Gracie taken away. Grace asked if tomorrow afternoon would work for a home visit. I heard myself agreeing, even though I wanted to scream. I called Kayla the second Grace hung up. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. I was talking too fast and probably not making sense. Kayla's calm voice cut through my panic. She said CPS had to investigate every report they received, even obviously false ones. Our documentation would help a lot. She talked me through what to expect during the home visit. They'd want to see where Gracie sleeps, check our food supply, look at the general condition of our home. They'd ask questions about the party incident. I should stay calm and factual. Provide our folder of documentation. Give them our pediatrician's contact information. Brian came home early from work after I texted him what happened. We spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning our already clean house. Both of us anxious about strangers coming to judge whether we were fit parents. I organized Gracie's toys and made sure her room looked perfect. Brian scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed. We were exhausting ourselves with nervous energy, unable to sit still while waiting for tomorrow's visit. Gracie played happily through all of it, completely unaware that someone was coming to investigate whether her parents were good enough to keep her. The next afternoon, Grace Ferguson arrived exactly on time. She was carrying a leather folder and wearing an expression that gave nothing away. She introduced herself calmly and asked to walk through our home, starting with the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator and watched her examine the contents. She noted our fresh vegetables and milk with Gracie's name on it.
She checked the pantry next,
writing something on her clipboard about our stocked shelves. Brian stood nearby, answering her questions about our typical meal routines while I tried not to shake. Grace moved methodically through each room, looking in closets and checking smoke detectors. She asked about our cleaning schedule and how we organized Gracie's toys. When we reached Gracie's bedroom, our daughter bounced excitedly on her bed. She grabbed her favorite stuffed elephant to show the nice lady. Grace smiled for the first time and asked Gracie about her toys. My daughter proudly displayed her books and dolls, completely unaware this woman was deciding if we were fit parents. Grace took notes while Gracie chattered about her daycare friends and her favorite bedtime stories. After touring the house, Grace sat with us at the kitchen table. She asked detailed questions about the birthday party. I walked through the timeline again, explaining the seizure and our response. She wrote everything down without commenting. Brian provided copies of the seizure management chapter from his book and his pediatric first aid certifications. Grace reviewed the documents carefully. She asked if we had Gracie's medical records available. I pulled out the folder we'd prepared with every vaccination record, child visit summary, and growth chart from the past 3 years. Our pediatrician's contact information was paper-clipped to the front. Grace flipped through each page, nodding occasionally. She seemed satisfied with our documentation, but explained the investigation would remain open for at least 30 days while they verified everything with our doctor and daycare. My stomach dropped at hearing we'd be under investigation for a full month. As Grace stood to leave, she mentioned almost casually that the person who filed the report claimed we had a history of neglecting Gracie. I felt my face flush hot knowing Patty had invented complete lies. Grace handed me her card and said she'd be in touch. Then she walked out to her car. The second the door closed, I collapsed onto the couch and started crying. Brian sat beside me and pulled me close. He reminded me the visit went well and we had nothing to hide. I knew he was right, but the fear of losing Gracie over family lies made me feel physically sick. We'd done everything correctly during Zaki's seizure, and now we were being investigated like criminals. My phone rang an hour later. I saw it was my grandmother. I answered hoping for support, but she immediately started lecturing me about causing family drama. She said I needed to apologize to Patty and make this all go away. I tried explaining that I saved Zaki's life. She talked right over me. She kept saying Patty was just a worried mother, and I was being selfish by not thinking about her feelings. I felt anger building in my chest listening to her defend Patty while ignoring what actually happened. When she started saying I should have let the adults handle the emergency, I hung up on her. I'd never done that before. I immediately felt guilty and free at the same time. Brian looked at me with surprise. I told him what she'd said. He shook his head and said we didn't need that negativity right now. Later that afternoon, Brian's laptop dinged with a new email. His face went pale reading it. His publisher was officially pausing all marketing for his book until the controversy was resolved. They wrote about protecting the brand and managing negative attention. Brian stared at the screen for a long time before quietly closing his laptop. I could see tears forming in his eyes, even though he was trying to hide them. His book had been doing so well, and now Patty's lies were destroying everything he'd worked for. I sat next to him, and we didn't talk for a while. That evening, after putting Gracie to bed, we had a serious talk about my family. Brian said we needed to protect ourselves and Gracie, even if it meant cutting people off. He'd always supported my relationship with my family despite how they treated us. But now he was angry. We agreed no more family gatherings or contact with anyone who believed Patty's lies until this was resolved. It felt sad but also necessary. My mom called the next day and I let it go to voicemail. Later, I listened to her message begging me to be the bigger person and drop the legal issues. She didn't mention that Patty sued us first or that her granddaughter was under CPS investigation because of false reports. She just wanted me to make peace and pretend everything was fine. I didn't call her back. Protecting my daughter and husband had to come first, even if it meant losing my extended family. That same day, Rachel sent me a private message apologizing for how the party ended. She wrote that she knew I'd saved Zaki's life and was grateful. She admitted she was too scared of Patty to say anything publicly, but wanted me to know she didn't believe the lawsuit claims. Reading her message made me cry because it was the first support from any family member. I thanked her and told her I understood her position. At least someone saw the truth. A few days later, Kayla sent her formal response to Patty's lawyer. The letter rejected all demands and outlined our evidence that we acted correctly. She included Brian's credentials, our complete timeline, and a statement from our pediatrician confirming proper seizure management. The letter was professional but firm, making it clear we wouldn't be scared into paying money or apologizing for saving a child's life. Kayla emailed us a copy, and I felt proud reading it. We were fighting back instead of just taking the abuse. 2 weeks after the party, Patty's lawyer responded demanding we agree to mediation, or they'd file the lawsuit in court. Kayla called to explain that mediation might actually help because it was cheaper than court and could resolve things faster. I didn't want to sit in a room with Patty after everything she'd done. But Kayla said mediation gave us a chance to end this nightmare sooner without the expense of a trial. Brian and I talked it over and agreed to try mediation, hoping we could put this behind us and move on with our lives. A few days later, Grace called to schedule follow-up visits. Her voice stayed neutral and professional as she explained they needed to interview Brian and me separately about our parenting. She also mentioned they'd be talking to our daycare provider and pediatrician as part of the investigation. I gripped my phone tighter and forced myself to sound calm while confirming the appointment times. After hanging up, I sat on the couch staring at nothing, feeling like we were being punished for saving Zaki's life. The morning of my CPS interview, I put on my nicest work clothes and drove to their office building downtown. Grace led me to a small conference room with a recording device on the table. She asked me to walk through my medical training from the beginning. I explained my certification process, continuing education hours, and specific emergency response protocols I'd learned. When I got to the birthday party incident, I provided way more detail than during the home visit, describing exactly how I positioned Zaki, why I chose each action, and what signs I monitored throughout the seizure. Grace wrote constantly in her notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my family relationships. I told her the truth about years of judgment and criticism, how they treated Brian and me like incompetent children despite our success. She nodded and kept writing, but her face gave away nothing about whether she believed me or Patty's lies. The interview lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, I had no idea if I'd helped our case or made things worse. Brian's interview happened 2 days later. When he got home, he seemed cautiously hopeful. Grace had asked detailed questions about his book and parenting philosophy, spending extra time on the seizure management chapter. He walked her through the exact protocol we followed at the party, showing her the published guidelines we'd referenced. She seemed impressed by his credentials and research, asking where he'd gotten his information and how he verified medical accuracy. Brian felt like she could see we actually knew what we were doing, but we both understood the waiting would be awful until CPS made their final decision. That same week, Dr. Norris called while I was folding laundry in the living room. She started by saying CPS had contacted her for a reference and she'd given us a glowing review. Her voice was angry as she said she was appalled anyone would question our parenting after seeing how well we care for Gracie. She offered to provide a written statement for our legal case. I thanked her so many times, I probably sounded ridiculous. Having a professional who actually knew us confirm we were good parents meant everything after weeks of family accusations. 2 days later, the daycare director, Bella Armstrong, reached out with similar news. She explained that CPS had interviewed her about Gracie. She'd told them our daughter was well cared for, happy, and hitting all her developmental milestones right on schedule. Bella mentioned she'd worked in childcare for 20 years, and we were among the most attentive and engaged parents she'd ever seen. I started crying on the phone with her, surprised by how much I needed to hear those words from someone outside our situation. 3 weeks after Rachel's birthday party, we drove to a neutral mediation office across town. Kayla met us in the parking lot, and we walked in together. My stomach twisted when I saw Patty and Dennis already sitting in the waiting area with their lawyer. Patty glared at me like I was some kind of monster who'd hurt her family on purpose. The mediator was an older woman named Sandra who led us all into a conference room and explained the ground rules. She emphasized that everything said in mediation was private, and we were here to find a solution both sides could accept. Patty's lawyer opened by claiming we'd caused Zaki severe trauma through our negligence. Their family deserved compensation for immense emotional distress. He talked about how scared they'd been watching their son have a seizure and how our failure to act properly had made everything worse. Kayla stayed completely calm as she presented our evidence, laying out the timeline, Brian's credentials, and medical documentation proving we'd handled the seizure correctly. She walked through each action we took and matched it to proper protocol from multiple medical sources. The mediator asked Patty's lawyer to provide any medical evidence that we'd acted wrong. He admitted they didn't have any. Sandra called for a private caucus and led Kayla, Brian, and me to a smaller room down the hall. Kayla closed the door and told us Patty's case was falling apart, but they might still file in court just to be spiteful. She recommended offering a mutual agreement where both sides dropped all claims and agreed to no future contact. I felt anger rise in my chest at the idea of any agreement that didn't include Patty admitting she'd lied about everything. Kayla explained gently that getting Patty to admit fault was completely unrealistic. We needed to focus on ending this nightmare. When we went back to the main room, Sandra suggested a settlement where everyone agreed to stop all legal action and public statements about the incident. Patty immediately cut in, demanding we pay her $10,000 and Brian issue a public apology for his dangerous parenting advice. Her voice was sharp and greedy, showing she was still just after our money. Kayla firmly rejected any payment, and the mediation ended with no agreement reached. Sandra looked disappointed as she explained that meant Patty would likely file her lawsuit in court. We left the building feeling defeated and angry after wasting 4 hours and racking up more legal fees for nothing. Brian stayed quiet during the drive home, staring out the window at passing traffic. He finally admitted he was worried about the money, how the legal costs kept piling up, and how much worse this could get if we ended up in actual court. I squeezed his hand and promised we'd get through this together. But inside I was scared about how we'd afford everything and what would happen if CPS didn't close their investigation soon. The next day, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail requiring my signature. My hands shook as I signed for it, knowing exactly what was inside. I sat at our kitchen table and pulled out the legal documents. Patty's name was at the top of a formal lawsuit claiming $50,000 in damages for negligence, emotional distress, and child endangerment. The complaint was filled with legal language that made everything feel more real and scary than Patty's threats at the party. It described how we allegedly failed to act appropriately during Zaki's medical emergency and caused severe trauma to their family. I read through page after page of lies presented as facts, my stomach twisting as I saw how Patty's lawyer twisted the seizure incident into something we did wrong. Brian read over my shoulder, and I felt him tense up as we got to the part demanding we stop selling his book and issue a public apology. I immediately called Kayla, and she asked me to scan and email everything right away. She called back an hour later and tried to reassure us that the claims were still legally weak. But her tone was more serious now. We were officially in a lawsuit with all the costs and stress that came with it. Kayla explained we'd need to file a formal response within 30 days. She warned that Patty's lawyer would likely drag this out as long as possible. The retainer we'd paid was already half gone. She estimated we'd need at least another $5,000 to get through the initial phases. I hung up feeling sick about the money and terrified about what would happen if a judge somehow believed Patty's version of events. 3 days later, Brian was checking his book's Amazon page like he did every morning when his face went completely white. He turned his laptop toward me. His rating had dropped from 4.8 stars to 4.1 overnight with 17 new 1-star reviews. I read through them, and they were all posted within hours of each other. Clearly fake accounts, leaving identical complaints about dangerous advice. One review claimed Brian's seizure protocol nearly killed their nephew. Another said his book encouraged teen parents to ignore medical professionals. By the end of the week, his rating was down to 3.2 stars. His sales had dropped by 60% according to his publisher dashboard. Brian sat at our kitchen table scrolling through the hateful reviews with tears running down his face, watching years of hard work get destroyed by Patty's coordinated attack. He'd worked so hard researching and writing that book to help other young parents. Now it was being used as ammunition against us. I stood behind him, rubbing his shoulders as he clicked through review after review, all posted by brand new accounts with no other activity. His publisher emailed asking if he wanted to respond to the reviews. But Kayla had warned us not to engage with anything Patty might be behind. I watched my husband's dream of helping other families crumble while we couldn't even defend ourselves publicly. That night, I woke up at 2 in the morning and reached for Brian, but his side of the bed was empty. I found him sitting in the rocking chair in Gracie's room, just watching her sleep, his face wet with tears in the dim glow of her nightlight. He didn't look up when I came in, just kept staring at our daughter like he was trying to memorize her face. I knelt beside the chair and put my hand on his knee, waiting for him to talk when he was ready. He finally whispered that he was scared we'd lose everything we'd built together. Our savings, our reputation, maybe even Gracie if CPS believed Patty's lies. His voice cracked as he said he'd worked so hard on his book to prove we were good parents and help other young families. Now it was being used to destroy us. I climbed into his lap in that rocking chair meant for holding Gracie. I held him while he cried, both of us exhausted from weeks of stress and feeling helpless against Patty's attacks. We sat there for over an hour just holding each other in the dark, listening to Gracie's peaceful breathing and trying to remember why we were fighting so hard. My phone rang during my lunch break at work. I saw Grace's number, and my heart immediately started racing as I answered. She got straight to the point. CPS had completed their investigation and found no evidence of neglect or endangerment in our home. I actually started crying right there in the hospital break room as she explained they'd interviewed everyone, reviewed all our documentation, and determined Gracie was well cared for and thriving. Grace said they'd be officially closing the case and sending a letter confirming our home was safe and appropriate for raising children. I thanked her over and overthrew my tears. Weeks of fear finally lifting as she assured me the investigation was completely closed. She mentioned that the person who filed the report had made claims that weren't supported by any evidence they found, which felt like validation that Patty had lied. When I hung up, I sat in that break room, crying with relief for 10 minutes before I could pull myself together enough to call Brian. He answered on the first ring. I could barely get the words out to tell him CPS was closing the case. I heard him start crying too. We just stayed on the phone, breathing together for a minute, both too emotional to speak. The official CPS closure letter arrived 2 days later in a plain, white envelope. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. The letter stated clearly that their investigation found no evidence to support the allegations of neglect or endangerment. The case was officially closed. I immediately scanned it and emailed it to Kayla, then called to make sure she got it. She was excited when she answered. She said this significantly weakened Patty's lawsuit since CPS finding no merit to the claims would be powerful evidence. Kayla explained that having an official government agency investigate and clear us might even convince Patty's lawyer to drop the whole case. Asked if we should send it to my family to prove Patty lied. Kayla said no contact meant no contact even with good news. I took the letter to a frame shop that afternoon and had it professionally framed, then hung it on our bedroom wall as a reminder that we were good parents no matter what my family said. Brian stood looking at it that night and said it was the most important document we owned besides Gracie's birth certificate. At work the next week, I was finishing up paperwork when the overhead system announced a code blue in pediatrics. I ran to the room and found a 6-year-old boy choking on a piece of candy. His mother was screaming while he turned blue. I moved on autopilot, getting behind him and performing the Heimlich maneuver exactly like my training taught me. The candy flew out after 3 compressions, and the kid started crying and breathing normally. His mother hugged me, sobbing with relief, while I checked his vitals and made sure he was okay. My supervisor was standing in the doorway. She pulled me aside after we'd calmed the family down. She said she'd watched me handle that emergency with the same calm skill I showed during Zacky's seizure at the party. Her exact words were that she never doubted my abilities despite the complaints my family had called in about me. That compliment meant more than she probably knew because Patty's accusations had made me second-guess myself even though I knew I'd done everything right. Walking back to my station, I felt some of my confidence returning, remembering that I was actually good at my job, no matter what my family said. Kayla called a few days later, sounding cautiously optimistic. She was filing a motion to dismiss Patty's lawsuit based on the CPS findings and lack of medical evidence. She walked me through the legal argument that Patty couldn't prove we acted improperly when every official investigation and medical expert said otherwise. The judge would review our motion and Patty's response before deciding whether to dismiss or let the case continue to trial. Kayla warned that even with our strong evidence, the process could still take months because courts moved slowly. She also mentioned that our legal fees had now reached $8,000 between the retainer, mediation, and filing the motion. Brian and I sat down that night and looked at our bank account, doing math we didn't want to do. We'd already drained most of our savings. Now we had to pause contributions to Gracie's college fund just to cover our legal costs. It made me furious that we were spending money meant for our daughter's future just to defend ourselves against Patty's lies. My phone buzzed with a message from Rachel a week later. I almost didn't open it, not sure I could handle more family drama. Her message said Zacky had been to a pediatric neurologist for a follow-up after the seizure. She'd taken a photo of the doctor's report. It clearly stated that Zacky had experienced a typical febrile seizure and our response had been medically appropriate. The neurologist's notes specifically mentioned that turning him on his side and monitoring the seizure duration was the correct protocol. Rachel wrote that she wished she could testify on our behalf, but Patty had forbidden any family contact with us. She was scared of the consequences. I immediately screenshot everything she sent and forwarded it to Kayla as more evidence. Even though Rachel couldn't support us publicly, having that doctor's report felt like proof that we'd done everything right. I sent her a quick thank you message and told her I understood her position, grateful that at least one family member saw the truth. That same week, my grandmother left a voicemail that I listened to on speaker with Brian. Her voice was sharp and accusing as she said I'd torn the family apart and needed to fix this mess before the holidays. She went on about how Patty was just a worried mother and I was being selfish by dragging this out with lawyers and court filings. Not once did she mention that Patty had sued us first or filed false CPS reports that could have gotten Gracie taken away. According to grandmother, I was the problem for not apologizing and keeping the peace like a good family member should. I saved the voicemail and sent it to Kayla as evidence of the ongoing family pressure. But I didn't call grandmother back. Brian squeezed my hand and said I didn't owe anyone an apology for protecting our family. He was right, even though it hurt to be blamed for everything. Brian got an email a few days later from a parenting podcast called Real Talk for Young Parents. The host wanted to interview him about handling false accusations. She'd read about our case on some parenting forum and thought our story would help other young parents facing family judgment. Brian showed me the email and said he didn't know if going public was a good idea. Worried it might make things worse with Patty. I called Kayla and asked her opinion, expecting her to say no. She surprised me by saying a podcast interview might actually help rebuild Brian's reputation after the review bombing destroyed his book ratings. She explained that telling our side of the story to a supportive audience could counteract Patty's lies and show people what really happened. Brian and I talked about it for hours that night, weighing the risks of going public against the chance to finally tell the truth. We decided he'd do the interview because staying silent hadn't protected us. Maybe the truth reaching more people would help. The podcast recording happened 3 days later at a small studio downtown. Brian sat across from the host wearing his nicest button-down shirt, the one I'd ironed that morning while he practiced his talking points. The host started by asking how we met. Brian told the story of us being lab partners in high school biology, which made everything feel more real and less like a legal defense. When she asked about the birthday party incident, Brian pulled out his phone and walked through the timeline we documented. He explained febrile seizures, using simple terms about how high fevers can trigger them in young kids. How they look scary, but usually aren't dangerous if you know what to do. The host asked what he'd recommend to parents who witness a seizure. Brian listed the steps exactly like his book chapter outlined. Turn the child on their side. Start timing. Remove tight clothing. Don't put anything in their mouth. Stay calm and speak soothingly. He talked about how panic makes everything worse and how having basic medical knowledge as a parent isn't about being perfect. It's about being prepared. The host mentioned the lawsuit. Brian's voice stayed steady as he said sometimes doing the right thing means facing consequences from people who don't understand. She asked about the book and he explained how he'd written it because he was tired of young parents being treated like they couldn't possibly know what they're doing. The interview lasted 40 minutes. When Brian came home, he looked exhausted but lighter somehow. Like finally telling our actual story to someone who listened had lifted weight off his shoulders. I hugged him in our kitchen and asked how it felt. He said it felt like maybe people would finally hear the truth instead of Patty's lies. The podcast episode went live the next Tuesday. I listened to it during my lunch break at work, sitting in my car with my phone pressed to my ear. Brian sounded so calm and knowledgeable, explaining everything. The host kept praising his book and his approach to evidence-based parenting. The comment section filled up fast with listeners saying they'd never heard of febrile seizures before and were grateful for the education. Several people wrote that they were ordering Brian's book right away because they wanted that kind of practical parenting information. One comment said her own mother had sued her over a similar family dispute. She felt less alone hearing our story. I screenshot the positive comments and sent them to Brian at work, watching the 3 dots appear as he typed back that maybe this was the beginning of things turning around. 2 weeks after the podcast aired, Brian checked his book sales dashboard and actually gasped loud enough that I ran into his office thinking something was wrong. His sales had jumped 30% from their lowest point and were climbing daily as more people found the podcast episode. The reviews section showed new 5-star ratings from listeners who said they'd bought the book after hearing him speak and found it incredibly helpful. Brian sat back in his desk chair staring at the numbers like he couldn't quite believe them. I watched his eyes get wet as months of stress started cracking. His publisher emailed that same afternoon with a carefully worded message asking if the negative publicity had died down enough to resume their marketing campaign. Brian read the email out loud. I could hear the hurt in his voice when he said they'd abandoned him so fast when things got hard. I sat on the edge of his desk and reminded him that at least they were coming back now. He nodded but said he'd never forget how quickly they pulled their support. He drafted a professional response saying he'd be open to discussing renewed marketing efforts and copied me on it before hitting send. Kayla called on a Thursday morning while I was getting Gracie dressed for daycare. I almost dropped my phone when I heard the excitement in her voice. The judge had granted our motion to dismiss most of Patty's claims, leaving only a weak emotional distress allegation that Kayla said wouldn't hold up in court. She explained that Patty's lawyer had reached out suggesting they might be willing to settle for a mutual agreement to drop everything with no money changing hands. I actually screamed with relief. Gracie looked up at me confused while I tried to explain to Kayla how much this meant. 2 months of legal hell were finally showing progress. I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time since the birthday party. Kayla warned me not to celebrate too much yet because we still needed to get through another mediation session. But her tone said she was confident we'd finally found our way out. I called Brian at work immediately after hanging up with Kayla. He went silent for a long moment before saying he'd been terrified this would drag on for years. We agreed to the mediation session that weekend, both of us desperate to end this nightmare, even if it meant sitting across from Patty again. The second mediation happened at the same office as before, but the whole atmosphere felt different this time. Patty's lawyer looked tired and kept glancing at his notes, like he knew his case had fallen apart. The mediator welcomed us back and laid out the proposed agreement where all legal claims would be dropped by both sides, and we'd agree to no future contact. Patty sat with her arms crossed glaring at me while her lawyer explained that they were willing to accept mutual dismissal without any financial settlement. Kayla calmly presented our position that we'd never pay a single dollar for saving Zaki's life and doing everything correctly. The mediator worked through the details of the agreement, specifying that no party would admit fault and all public statements about the incident would cease. Patty's lawyer kept trying to negotiate for some kind of apology from us. Kayla shut it down every time, reminding everyone that the judge had already dismissed most of their claims. The mediation lasted 3 hours with multiple private caucuses where Kayla would pull Brian and me into a separate room to discuss strategy. During one of these breaks, Brian squeezed my hand and said he just wanted this over so we could get back to our lives. Patty refused to apologize or admit she'd done anything wrong, sitting stone-faced while her lawyer read through the final agreement terms. She did agree to remove her false Facebook post and stop making any public statements about us or the incident. The mediator asked if we could all agree to these terms. Kayla looked at me for confirmation before nodding.
Yes.
It wasn't the vindication I'd dreamed about where Patty would have to publicly admit she'd lied and apologize for trying to destroy us. Kayla explained quietly that this was actually a good outcome because it ended the legal case without trial and got us out from under the constant stress. Brian and I signed the agreement at the conference table, our signatures shaky from exhaustion and relief. Patty signed without looking at us, and her lawyer gathered his papers quickly, like he wanted to escape. Walking out of that office felt surreal, knowing the lawsuit was finally over, but also knowing Patty would never acknowledge what she'd done to us. That evening, Brian and I sat at our kitchen table with all our legal bills spread out in front of us, adding up the final total: $12,000 in attorney fees, court costs, and related expenses. Our savings account that we'd built up so carefully over 3 years was almost empty. I felt sick looking at the numbers and thinking about how we'd paid all that money just to defend ourselves against lies. Brian pulled out his laptop and opened a spreadsheet to create a budget for rebuilding our emergency fund over the next year. We calculated how much we could save each month if we cut back on eating out and postponed some home repairs we'd been planning. It was frustrating that Patty's vindictiveness had cost us so much money and peace of mind. But at least the case was over, and we could start moving forward. I looked at Gracie playing with her blocks in the living room and reminded myself that protecting our family had been worth every dollar. With the legal case officially resolved, Brian and I had a serious conversation about boundaries with my family. We agreed we needed to establish no contact with Patty, Dennis, and my grandmother, who never once supported us through any of this. I drafted a message to my mom explaining that we couldn't maintain relationships with people who believed we'd endanger a child and who'd supported Patty's lawsuit. My mom called immediately after reading it, her voice hurt and confused as she asked how I could cut off my own grandmother. I explained as calmly as I could that grandmother had called me selfish and blamed me for tearing the family apart instead of acknowledging that Patty had sued us first. My mom argued that families should forgive and forget, that holding grudges only hurt everyone. I told her I was done prioritizing other people's comfort over my family's safety and mental health. She went quiet for a long moment before saying she hoped I'd change my mind someday. I said maybe someday, but not now. Hanging up that call felt both terrible and necessary, like cutting off an infected limb to save the rest of the body. Rachel sent me a message 2 weeks later asking if we could meet for coffee. I stared at my phone for 10 minutes trying to decide if I could trust any family member after everything. I finally agreed to meet at a coffee shop near my work, choosing a public place where I'd feel safer. Rachel showed up 5 minutes early, looking nervous. She ordered a latte and sat across from me at a small table by the window. She apologized immediately for not defending us publicly, explained she'd been terrified of Patty's retaliation after watching what happened to us. I appreciated her honesty, even though part of me was still angry she'd stayed silent while Patty destroyed our reputation. Rachel said she'd known all along that we'd saved Zacky's life, and the lawsuit was completely wrong. But she'd been too scared to speak up. We talked for over an hour about family dynamics and how Patty controlled everyone through fear and manipulation. I told Rachel I was willing to slowly rebuild our relationship, but made it clear that any future contact required respecting our boundaries around Patty and grandmother. She agreed without hesitation and said she understood why we'd gone no contact with certain family members. Brian's book sales continued climbing steadily over the following weeks as more people discovered the podcast episode and positive word of mouth spread. His publisher called to discuss a second printing with updated marketing materials. Brian negotiated better terms this time, having learned from how quickly they'd abandoned him before. He started working on a second book about handling family criticism as a young parent, channeling all the pain from our experience into something that might help other people going through similar situations. I'd watch him typing at his desk late at night, pouring everything we'd survived into chapters about setting boundaries and protecting your nuclear family. He'd read sections out loud to me, and I'd cry sometimes hearing our story transformed into advice that could help someone else. Watching him turn this trauma into something purposeful made me incredibly proud of how we'd handled everything. How we'd refused to let Patty's vindictiveness break us. 3 months after the birthday party, Gracie had her regular checkup with Dr. Norris. I carried her into the familiar exam room feeling almost normal again. Dr. Norris did her usual thorough examination, checking Gracie's growth, development, and overall health. She commented on how happy and healthy Gracie looked, meeting all her milestones and clearly thriving. When the exam finished, Dr. Norris asked how Brian and I were doing after everything we'd been through. I was honest that we were still recovering financially and emotionally from the lawsuit. She sat down on her rolling stool and looked at me seriously. She said she wanted me to hear this clearly. We were excellent parents, and Gracie was thriving specifically because of the love and care we provided. All the judgment from my family, all the accusations and legal threats, none of that changed the fact that we were doing an amazing job raising our daughter. I cried in that exam room while Gracie played with the toy stethoscope, finally hearing validation from someone whose professional opinion actually mattered. The following Saturday afternoon, we took Gracie to the park. I watched her climb on the playground equipment without the constant worry that had lived in my chest for months. She laughed as she went down the slide, and I actually felt relaxed instead of scanning for threats or waiting for the next crisis. Brian wrapped his arm around me while we sat on the bench. He told me he was proud of how we protected our family through everything. I leaned into him and felt grateful for our little unit, even if it meant being disconnected from most of my extended family. Gracie ran over, demanding we push her on the swings. We took turns sending her higher, while she squealed with joy. The simplicity of the moment felt almost foreign after months of legal stress and family drama. On Monday at work, my coworker Jennifer pulled me aside during our break. She mentioned that her sister went through something similar with vindictive in-laws who tried using the legal system against her. She offered to connect us for support if I wanted to talk to someone who understood what we'd been through. I realized we weren't alone in dealing with toxic family dynamics. There was actually a whole community of people who'd had to choose their nuclear family over extended relatives. Jennifer said her sister came out stronger and happier after setting firm boundaries, which helped knowing others had survived this and rebuilt their lives. That night, after putting Gracie to bed, Brian and I sat on our couch reviewing everything we'd been through over the past few months. We acknowledged how much stronger we were now after handling a medical emergency, a frivolous lawsuit, a CPS investigation, and complete family betrayal, while still being great parents to Gracie. Our life looked different from what I'd imagined back when I was pregnant at 18 with my whole family predicting I'd fail. We had limited contact with most of my relatives now. Our savings account was seriously depleted from legal fees. But sitting there with Brian's arm around me and our daughter sleeping peacefully in her room, I felt genuinely happy and secure in the family we'd built together. That was everything that mattered.
Catch you again soon.